Yeah. Do you guys have 2 minutes for me to talk to you guys about bias and how it fits into what I do? Is that cool? And then I would love to hear your questions too. So, counteracting bias. Oh, you're like in a little thing back there. Hi. I'm going to come over here. That was scary. Okay. You guys have really cool seats. So, let's talk about bias. You guys have been talking about it in class, and that figures into what we do every day because our jobs as journalists is to find out the truth about something and tell people the best understandable version of the truth that we can find, knowing that sometimes it's not easy to figure out the truth or you only know part of the truth. But our job as journalists is to figure out as much of the truth as we can without bias and present it to people, understanding that all the people watching are going to have their own biases and that we have our biases. And who has biases? Everybody, okay? So, how does it work for somebody whose job every day is to tell the truth without bias? Well, for me, it starts with acknowledging what my own biases are. Anytime I start looking at a subject, I have to acknowledge to myself, what do I already think about it? What about the way that I was raised, where I live, my family, my work, everything? What do I bring to this that affects the way that I look at it? And then the way that I counteract my bias is I make sure that I'm working twice as hard to account for all the other points of view in a story. So I work to actively counteract my known bias every day. But at the same time, I also know that there are implicit biases. There are biases that are kind of baked in. Is that something that you guys have talked about at all?
A little bit.
Okay. So I may be biased in ways that I don't even understand. So if I don't even understand how I'm biased in that way, then how can I properly counteract it? And the answer is I can't do it alone. I need other smart people around me who can say, you may not even know, but you're seeing it through this lens because it's the only lens that you know. So you can check that bias by having smart people around you who aren't afraid to challenge you and say, actually, look at it through this lens. Because you may not even know that you have those glasses on because you were born with them or they've just become so natural to you. So that's how I fight bias every day, and that's how I deal with the lenses that people look through things through. I would love to hear your questions, or maybe you can tell me something that you guys have learned that I can take back to my team. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Gage. I just have something to say.
Yes.
You're under ethics.
I'm under ethics. Oh, look at that. Hey, how about that?
I have a question. So, I actually have a comment. So I hope you caught what he said about have someone around you who isn't afraid to challenge you. And that's when we get into that whole piece on judging, and that's why we don't judge, right? But we can't just agree with everybody. So who can explain to Mr. Clark a little bit about how do we put ourselves in opportunities in this room to make sure that we're hearing different perspectives? What are some ways that we do that in here? Rowan?
That we don't just sit with our friends every day. We sit with other people that we might not be comfortable with to get their point of view.
Awesome.
We sit in different places, that way we can also get another point of view, and we have other...
Callie?
We sit around the room, even if it means that you might not be able, if you're not sitting next to someone that you might not be comfortable with, or you're not sitting next to someone that one of your friends that'll be afraid to tell you something that you don't want to hear. So you sit by different people in new places every day because you see what other people have to say and what that spot means to you.
Good. So we work hard on that, so I think that was a really cool thing for us to hear. You need to have people around you who challenge you. All right, are there any other questions for, yes, Mr. Ballard?
How much do you think bias is in news?
I think bias is in every human person, and people make up the news. So I think it is everywhere. I think it is inseparable. This is kind of next level stuff, but you guys seem super bright, so I'll just say this. The other aspect that goes into the news is that the news is a product, okay? And any product is something that's sold to you, okay? The reason why you guys have the water bottles that you do is because something about them appealed to you because they were sold to you as a product. And the news is different in some ways, but it's the same in some other ways. So it's packaged in a way to appeal to some people. Some news is packaged to appeal to everybody, and some news is packaged to appeal just to certain people. And that's one way that bias comes in. That to me is not so much bias as it is marketing or it is product placement. There are all kinds of products in the world that are designed to make the people who buy them feel smart and pretty, and news is no different, all right? There's a good chance that somebody that you know watches the news that they do because it makes them feel good, which is not why news exists. News should exist to inform you of things, not to make you feel good about the things you already think you believe. But yeah, bias is everywhere, but I think that's part of it too. In the swingy thingy in the back.
Then how would you deal with not being biased in news? How would you not be biased?
I think anybody who tells you that they are not biased has not spent enough time thinking about whether they are biased, because everybody is biased. It doesn't mean that you're unfair. It doesn't mean that you're mean. More than anything, it doesn't mean that you're unethical. It just means that you're human. So spend some time thinking about it, and it's a totally fair thing to ask somebody who works in the news or any profession where you have to be ethical, like, what's your plan to avoid bias or to be ethical? What's your ethical code? You could ask that of a doctor or a mechanic or a plumber or anybody. Anybody should have an ethical code because it's just how you treat other people. That's all that is.
Can I point out something? He just used the word ethical, which is where he's standing under, which is what we're trying to break our minds around a little bit, because it's tough. Ethics is tough.
Yep. One thing that I've talked to a number of school groups about is the idea of, I like the idea that you guys are mixing it up into different groups of people, but inevitably you're going to be in groups where most everybody agrees on something. And there's going to be somebody who is going to be the outlier in terms of what they think or what they believe or their experience or whatever else. And it may not be the same person every day on every different issue. But I challenge people, adults and people your age, are you standing up for the one person who believes something different? And that could be your best friend when everybody else disagrees. That could be somebody that you don't get along with. Are you making space for their point of view? Not for a point of view, not the same point of view all the time, because it's going to depend on the situation. But just, are you always looking out for the one voice that is outnumbered and saying, we may not agree, but let's just listen. Let's listen to what that person says. You can do that every single day. Yes, ma'am.
What job are you going to do and which news are you going to do?
So my job is to anchor and report the news at 9 News. So I've been there for 10 years. It's a long time.
Wow.
They hired me as a child. But right now I do a show called Next every night at 6 o'clock, which is kind of a different type of news program. We try not to shout at you and tell you that the world is horrible. And then I do newscasts at 9 and 10 o'clock on 9 News.
Dad, he watches the news all the time for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which is very exhausting.
I imagine that would be exhausting. Does he always watch the same news, or does he flip around?
Same news.
Oh, he's got to flip around. You got to flip around.
Okay, over here real quick, and then we'll let Mr. Clark go.
So, like, let's say when you're interviewing someone, is it hard to, like, slow down your thoughts, kind of, so that you can, like look through their point of view?
That is a really good question. It helps that I don't have that many thoughts. You know, they come kind of slow to me. Listening is super key. I see a lot of people interview and they've got a sheet of questions and they just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you're doing that, then you're not listening. I'll go into interviews sometimes with 10 questions and I'll only ask 3 of them because we started talking about more interesting things. So listening should be 60 to 70% of any conversation that you're having. So that's a really, really good question. It's hard to do.
It is, and that's something that I loved hearing that, because that can help me grow too. Because in this classroom, I can do a lot of talking. Is that what we want? Is this my classroom?
It's ours.
It's ours. So listening is a huge piece of that. That's great advice.
Well, thank you guys for having me. Thank you. You asked really good questions. So I'm glad you're talking about this. This is really important. Like for adults and for people who are growing up, this is a super important thing to talk about.
I agree. Hey, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What do we say?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Mr.
Make the news interesting.
I will make the news interesting. I'm going to make the news